I just want to mention one of the communities I was recently working with, talking about site identification, actually led a public engagement effort. I hope they don't mind me picking on them right now. I'm staring at you in the row. But they led a public engagement session. Their Affordable Housing Committee did this. It was online, and the community came out to listen to both the local housing issues that they had, but most importantly, at the end of the session, they had the public talk about the variety of sites that they could be open to for housing. And it was so interesting when the public got involved with this, where they began to brainstorm very creatively, right? The underutilized sites, they took zoning away. We told everyone to ignore zoning, ignore everything. Where are the sites and communities that are ready to be adaptively reused? What's vacant? What could be scaled up? And they have a list now. The Affordable Housing Committee has a list of sites that the public sort of gave them in terms of, these are potential places. So I want to applaud. They're also going to come up later, the village of Dobbs Ferry, for doing that. It was a great effort. Yep, look, they're doing a little, yep. And we were very excited by that. Karen, James, come on up. And we'll move. And Raju, where's Raju? Oh, there we go. Whatever, however, because you guys can stand up here. And the clicker's right. So I'm going to transition right now into our next session. So we're looking at creative sites for future development. We have that statewide production goal that was announced. And again, we're just thinking proactively here in this conference. We know that New Rochelle and White Plains and Poughkeepsie and Pleasantville and Ossining we're going to be hearing from, and Croton have all been really looking at TOD, at transit-oriented development. We've seen a surge of housing productions in these communities, and it's yielding more homes for individuals. And so what we wanted to do is focus a little bit. We have Raju Mann here. There we go. Hold on. There we go. Raju Mann, who's an associate principal from ARUP, joining us, who's going to share a little bit of insight into a new report they did that was commissioned by the New York Housing Conference, talking about the housing situation and a housing compact. And then most interestingly, even though I love the report, the end of the report, which Raju's going to show, starts to talk about, here's a potential site, what could that look like? And start to play with what that density might could be, and how we possibly don't need to be scared by that. We have James Wendling here as the Chief Operating Officer, a good friend of the Land Use Law Center from Wilder Balter Partners. During some of our training programs, we've actually taken people on bus rides to visit sites of Wilder Balters and show them what the affordable housing looks like that they've created across the region. And they've been doing a lot of transit-oriented development work. We have Karen DeTore, village manager from the village of Ossining, also a good friend of the center, sharing her perspectives on ways in which a municipality, again, can be proactive in furthering their housing initiatives and how municipalities can help further this along. And then we'll turn to Kate Van Tassel, again, director of special projects from HCR, to reflect a little bit on what the panelists have said, and then discuss some next steps and funding opportunities and technical support, again, from HCR. Whew. Okay, on all that I just literally just went through, I'm going to turn it to Raju to kick us off.
Okay, great. Let's stand up.
Yeah.
Just to get a little exercise. Okay. Hello, everybody. Again, my name is Raju Mann. I work at this planning, design, engineering firm called ARUP down in the city. I've only been there about 8 months. Before that, I used to be the land use director for the New York City Council, so worked a lot with elected officials and communities. Sorry about that. So I was just describing my prior background. I used to work with elected officials and communities and developers around growth issues in New York. So I feel your pain, I think, in many respects. And the context here is really that we worked with the New York Housing Conference, which is an affordable housing advocate across the state, on a report that dovetailed with a lot of the governor's advocacy around the New York Housing Compact. So I'll run through some of our findings from that. So brief, just little policy context, and Kate will correct me when I get things wrong here. Sort of what is the really rationale and need for housing growth? I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes on that. And then talk a little bit about New York in the context of other American states here, because I think it's actually, we're at this interesting watershed moment around land use reform at the state level. that's really happening across the country, and then talk briefly about really what does this mean practically on the ground. So again, just a really quick overview of this. There's a lot of information on the slide. I think a lot of you are experts in this already, but the governor, I think, very admirably put forward a very bold housing agenda um, with a number of different planks and strategies for increasing housing production across the state. There was a clear unit target goal to really respond to the housing need in the state, and there's a variety of mechanisms, legislative and financial, to support achieving those housing goals. I'm going to focus a little bit on the transit-oriented development piece of the puzzle here, but I just wanted to note that it's in a larger context of housing ambition. So as was mentioned in the earlier panel, I think one of the framework assumptions is that each part of the state needs to do its fair share from a housing growth standpoint. It's not all the same share. Some places need to grow more quickly than others for a variety of reasons, but primarily economic and housing shortages. So this geography created of the MTA region and north of that to reflect where housing made the most sense. And then this is more of a quick refresher. There was a framework, a special framework put in place where, depending on your proximity to the economic core of the city and the transit access, there were higher or lower growth targets assigned. And we can see that on this map here, where I think today we're in Tier 1 zone, the 50 dwelling units per acre. And as you radiate outwards, the density requirements lessen. Right, so that's the quick overview of the proposal. I should note, too, that there's, I think, a really key kind of policy point being made in the proposal, which is that we're also, as a state, spending billions and billions and billions of dollars upgrading our transit system. So just in Long Island alone, we looked at the last 3 capital plans, we spent about $18 billion upgrading Long Island Railroad for commuters. At the same time, there's very little housing growth. So we're spending significant public dollars, but the beneficiaries of that are relatively limited. And we put through a number in there, about $6,000 per Long Island resident, just in MTA spending. So a little step back in terms of the housing policy context of this. This is one of the, I think, more stark housing policy slides that I've seen, which is that during COVID, I mean, we've known the run-up in housing costs for the last couple of decades. Everybody in this room is living that reality and understands that very, very well. And what's even more dramatic is the last couple of years, rents have continued to increase. Actually, they've increased faster, and incomes have dropped. So that gap between income and rent is actually widening across the state, which I think should be something that distresses us all. And then, this was a slide pulled from actually the governor's work and Kate's work, that as we see this yawning gap between income and rent, we're also building some of the least amount of housing of any comparable region in the country. You can see Long Island, Lower Hudson there at the bottom, compared to our colleagues and friends in New Jersey or Virginia. So in the kind of regional, national context, we're not doing our part to keep up from a housing production standpoint. And one of the fun parts about this little research project is we work with our friends at Zillow to really try to get up to the date market information. So we released a report in March. So this is data from January, which is the most recent available data that we had. And so if you look at what's available in the real estate market in places like Nassau and Westchester County, today, if you're on the market today looking for a home, in order to afford a typical rental in Nassau County, you've got to make $135,000 per year, assuming that 30% of your income goes to rent, which is the sort of traditional metric for affordability. And median income is, about half that in these places. So it's one thing if you've lived there maybe for 10 years, there's maybe some perhaps natural affordability in that unit. But if you're on the market today, you need to basically make double the median income to be able to afford a new apartment. So not a sustainable situation. And certainly generationally speaking, if you're in your 20s, will force you to move out of the region, right? Because it's not really an option. And I don't want to, I think, again, this is a savvy, sophisticated audience. I don't want to belabor these points. But the other, I think, the other point worth noting here is that New York, compared to other parts of the country, has a bigger gap on home ownership if you're a Black family or a Hispanic or Latino family. So it's not that it's bad, it's worse than in the rest of the US here. So again, it's something that I think we should all be quite concerned about. And the flip side of that, which I think is an interesting point, is that we have a tremendous amount of single-family housing stock, right? Again, this is not probably news to this audience, but, and I apologize for picking on Long Island. For those of you who are from Long Island, I love Long Island. But Long Island in particular has, 83% of the housing on Long Island is single-family, right? And finally, we are privileging kind of one land use, I think, problematically over housing, which is parking. There are, I'm sure you all have read studies. I think there's something like 4 or 5 parking spaces in this country per car, right? So we're way over parked as a country. And we need to start to rethink that. And many states, in fact, are. Just coincidentally, there was actually a bill introduced in Congress, I think last week, to limit parking requirements. Which is the first time I've ever heard Congress deciding to get involved in parking requirements, right? Again, it's a bill's introduced, it's a long way from going anywhere, but I think it's a signal that there's a kind of wide acceptance that we've erred in some of our policymaking, and I think parking is probably an obvious example. And I think Buffalo's eliminated parking requirements. I think I made this sort of silly anecdote before, but Anchorage, Alaska, where it's probably about 20 degrees right now, and has no public transportation system, has eliminated parking requirements. So, I think as a region, there's, I think, a lot more that we can be doing to actually just even keep up with the policy innovation around the country. So that's a nice transition to talking a little bit about what else is happening in the country. I mean, I think this is really now a national phenomenon. A couple of examples I've pointed to here are mostly West Coast, Oregon, and California. I think I've got a New Jersey and Massachusetts slide in here, but Montana is now in the process of actually approving state legislation to limit the way in which local governments can restrict multifamily housing. Texas is having a similar debate right now about restrictive zoning and single-family zoning and ways to unwind that. So it's not just a sort of liberal, progressive kind of story here of states sort of doing do-gooder policy. It's kind of the urgency of the housing crisis. And states like Montana and Texas and Oregon and New Jersey are all doing something. I think it's an indication that there's a pretty broad pattern. And so, in the Oregon context, very small cities have essentially restricted single-family zoning and have minimum development requirements, which are very similar to what the governor proposed. I think, as I note here, in some cases like tier 2 or 3, which is the sort of slightly outer ring suburbs. Massachusetts has a slightly different strategy, but it's really about withholding funding for some municipalities that don't achieve certain local housing and zoning targets. So there's different states are taking a slightly different flavor to get to the same outcome. And California's got a very similar kind of story as Oregon, which is about requiring minimum density targets that are much higher than single-family zoning. In some cases, very analogous to the Tier 1 framework that the governor proposed. So I wanted to make those points because I do think that this is a kind of a national movement that's happening here, and I think in New York it's really an if and a how, not a when conversation, because I think the housing challenges are too acute, and the pattern of states looking at this stuff, I think, is starting to signal pretty clearly a direction forward. So before I kind of go through a couple of examples of sort of, I think, the ways in which we try to model why this is actually a really positive thing in these communities, just one final note about single-family versus multifamily housing. Again, we used that same Zillow data set back in January just to look at, if you're building a condo or a co-op, how does that compare with single-family costs in these places? And not surprisingly, right, it's kind of intuitive. Single-family houses are more expensive than condos and co-ops or rentals. And so again, if you were on the market in January of 23, which is when we pulled the Zillow data from, and you were looking for a single-family house, which again, 83% of Long Island is single-family houses, you were likely to pay about $500 more a month than a condo or co-op based on available listing data. In Suffolk, that number goes up a little bit. And so I think this is really a story about the sort of somewhat intrinsic of affordability of multifamily housing as opposed to single-family housing. And I think it's just another important observation that the housing data is showing us. Okay, as Tiffany mentioned, we just also tried to help with the New York Housing Conference, just imagine what some of these changes could look like. So it didn't, I think, to the earlier panel's point, feel so abstract and scary. And so we just, in this deck, I just going to run through a couple of examples. Tier 1, again, as just a reminder, is that sort of inner tier within 15 miles of New York City with a 50 dwelling unit per acre. And Tier 2 is slightly outside, 15 to 30 miles from the city with 30 dwelling units per acre. So we actually model these on real places. We kind of anonymize the information on these slides because didn't really want to make it a particularly personal conversation about any place, but we pulled from, sort of real life examples. So this is a site, maybe there's somebody who's really got savvy eyes here who'll be able to pick out where this is. But it's a site, adjacent to a train station in Tier 1. We sort of express here in the pink, the sort of commercial corridor, and in the yellow, the low density housing that's already there today. Here's a picture of that place. Like a lot of these train stations, surrounded by quite a bit of parking, one-story retail in this case around it. We picked, a sort of pretty grim black and white before photo, as you can see. What helps to make the case, that's a key part of this strategy. And then we just, note the kinds of features we think communities would like to see. Safer pedestrian crossings, more landscaping, activation of the ground floor. So as you walk to your morning train, there's something more for you to see and do. And then housing, obviously. And then here's an image of, we modeled it based on the density that the proposal included. So this building ends up being between a 4 and 5 story building adjacent to a train station. You can see we've got this nice tree in bloom in the spring. We've got ground floor retail activation. And I think that the point we were trying to make, not just is that you can do this and it's not scary, and in fact, it can be quite optimistic that these places and all the communities that you're working in have lots of opportunity to better address the needs of the local communities, whether it's housing or retail or safer streets. And we don't need to just be operating in a fear context. We can be operating with some optimism around what the future can be. Here's another example of a tier 2, right? Again, this is between 15 and 30 miles outside New York City with 30 units per acre as a target. Here, this happened to be in a train station sort of closer to industrial land. And so we modeled a site that we thought would be a likely development site, assuming the industrial would remain, because it looked like pretty key transportation facilities. Again, right, parking next to a train station, which is within 30 minutes of Midtown Manhattan. It's hard to make the case that this is the right answer. And again, we just sort of sketch out what we think are some opportunities to improve it, slightly more pedestrian friendly. Again, ground floor retail, landscaping, housing, the same sorts of amenities we think many folks are looking for. And then here's an example again of what the density could look like. A 3-story building, roughly, that's actually more than 30 dwelling units per acre. Still plenty of parking if needed on street, landscaping, safer streets, more ground floor activation. So I think what we were hoping to do with this was just try to provide some measure of context here, what these densities actually meant, and the ways in which they could actually improve some of these downtowns or TODs that I think were not necessarily achieving our collective objectives. And then finally, just in terms of policy benefit summary, just as a sort of, I think the things that we continue to, I think, believe strongly in on our end with the housing conference. And I guess I would just draw attention to that second bullet point in particular, which I think is one of the unspoken stories here, is that by building multifamily housing, you actually can increase the tax base of many of these communities. And again, you all know this better than I do, and in some ways lessen the burden on single family housing. And I think that's a really important piece of this story that doesn't get told as much about how that's actually a benefit to folks who own single family housing. And then, I think we know the economic benefits that it's very, very hard. I mean, I was on a panel a couple of months ago, and the healthcare systems will talk about how it's very hard to find nurses, right? Or, we all know the essential worker story from the last couple of years. But relatively high earning critical occupations just can't afford housing. And so there's a strong economic concern here that if we continue to go down the road of seeing median rents go up and median income flatten or go down, that'll continue to get worse. But there's a lot of positives here too in terms of, again, open space preservation and growing the economy and supporting small businesses. So hopefully that's helpful context. Thanks for the time. Thanks for all the work that you guys do on the ground. We appreciate it. And I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you, Raju. That was a great presentation. Again, my name is Jim Wendling from Wilder Balter Partners. It's great to be in a room with everybody on the same side in this conversation. Clearly, that presentation and the previous speakers, it's quite clear that there's a local and regional and national need for housing. And it's quite clear that there are components of the housing compact that can work. And I think I'm going to steal a line from Tim Foley, who I saw earlier. The housing compact has pushed this conversation front and center. And if nothing else, that's really important so that local leaders and municipal leaders and stakeholders can try to think proactively and creatively to figure out ways to solve this, or at least to start to solve this crisis. We know Westchester County, building in Westchester County is difficult. From the developer end, it's certainly a fair statement, I think. Building in New York State is really difficult. There's unique each municipality and town and village has their own concerns and their own interest and their own infrastructure requirements, and that makes it that much more difficult. But we're going to show you a few examples of hopefully some things that can get done. In some respects, this conversation started 15 years ago. There was the Housing County settlement. Our company built 35% of the 750 units that were required, working with Rose Noonan and Housing Action Council, all throughout Westchester County, all unique situations, five or six different communities in Westchester. And from the developer end, we believe in a public engagement process very early on, reaching out to the local stakeholders and neighbors and having conversations so that it's a collaborative approach. It's not a sledgehammer approach. We talk about what our vision may be for particular sites and see if there's a fit, see what the community needs to get out of that. And hopefully we can, by doing that, we can get there in an efficient and fast way. And it's a win for the developing community, and it provides more homes, obviously, for affordable homes. And it's a win for the community. And hopefully Karen's going to touch on some of that when she speaks, because we're working in Ossining right now. We have also walked away from great sites. We've walked away from sites that had zoning in place. And we did that, frankly, because we didn't think we were going to get there during the process. And it's frustrating, but our firm and every other firm only has a certain amount of bandwidth. So we don't want to work in communities where we think it's going to be a lengthy process or a process by the end where we're not certain of what the outcome is going to be. If it's an open, collaborative conversation, we'll feel better about it. But if it's an approach where there's a lot of maybes, there's a lot of pushback, then that's a drain on our resources, and we'd rather go to communities that are welcoming and want to have the conversation. So we started as basically a raw land development company, and we've switched to more transit-oriented development work in the past 7 or 8 years. And that was really triggered by what was going on in New Rochelle with their downtown overlay zone. RXR's work as the master developer created a lot of opportunities in the city. What do I do here, Tiffany? Yeah. Got it, thank you. I told you I was going to ask you for help at some point. So Stella is a great example of a transit-oriented development and an underutilized property. This site started as a funeral home. The first building we bought there was a vacant funeral home. We then bought seven adjacent properties and put together an assemblage and got 564 units approved. We built the first phase. The second phase will start next year. The first phase is 75% market rate, 25% affordable. It was a brownfield site, so it was cleaned up under the New York State brownfield cleanup program. In the downtown, walking distance to the train, walking distance to the shops and businesses and local restaurants. And again, all under the downtown overlay zone in New Rochelle. The city then sent out an RFQ, touching on a theme from Raju and some of the other speakers, of a city-owned parking lot, 117 dilapidated parking spaces that they wanted to build a development on that site and build additional parking. And one of the requirements of the RFQ was to build back 200 parking spaces and give that back to the village. So a net gain to the city of 83 parking spaces. We were selected as the designated developer. We built 25 Maple. We just turned over the parking to the city. So rather than now 117 surface parking spaces, there's 200 new parking spaces in the building with 184 units on top of that. As one of the things New Rochelle did that's pretty smart, it might be a lesson learned for other municipalities, is they created a fee structure to offset impacts for development. So a fair share mitigation fee to offset fire and school and emergency services, infrastructure. And then they did a community benefit bonus payment or public improvement that allows for more density. And what we did is a public improvement in the downtown. We reimagined a park plaza area that was built 25 years ago. We now just turned it over to the city. We had a ribbon cutting. They had their first event there about 3 weeks ago, an Earth Day event that was very well attended. It will be hopefully become an activated space by the city. Farmers market and parades and fairs. It's a great example of something that's a win for the community, because this will benefit the local area and all of the residents of New Rochelle. I'll pivot away from New Rochelle now on a few other examples of TODs that we're working on. I think Tarrytown's a great example. It was an underperforming YMCA, and we got involved and started local outreach very early on and talked to the community, talked to the surrounding neighbors, talked to the local stakeholders, and showed them our vision for this site and wanted to understand what was important to them. And parking was very important to them, and the preservation of the YMCA facade on Main Street. So also important to us. We've done a lot of preservation work, Chappaqua Crossing being one example. So because of that outreach, we got a zoning change and land use approvals in less than a year, which for those in this room, I think would recognize it's quite fast. 109 units, 88 new construction, 21 adaptive rehab use in the YMCA, preservation or restoration of the facade on Main Street, 68 parking spaces going back to the municipality, senior affordable on Main Street, walking distance to the train, walking distance to the town. Village supported it. There was a pilot granted. This will be an income average development, so families, I think this is 40 to 70% of AMI. So a really great opportunity in downtown Tarrytown. Peekskill's another great example. This site stood vacant for years. Zoning was not in place. It was a brownfield site, contaminated from previous uses. We reached out to Peekskill and the elected officials and local leaders. We brought them around to some of the work we had done to show them what we think could be done on this site, if zoning could be changed. And they were open to it. They understood that they had a need, and they had affordable housing would be a value add to their community. So this now is nearing completion. We cleaned it up again under the brownfield program. We got zoning and approvals in place, and again under a year, because of the local, the early outreach, we think, helped. We're building back public parking. We're building a pedestrian walkway that connects Center and Main, which makes it a more pedestrian-friendly area and connects the Main Street to the train. Again, village support, a pilot, income averaging, 82 units. We had 2,000 names in the lottery, so a lot of, obviously a lot of demand, as we know. And then I'm going to touch on Ossining, which Karen's going to speak more about, but Ossining sent out an RFQ 2019? 2019, very clear in what they wanted. They wanted affordable housing, village-owned piece of property, used by the DPW, contaminated from previous uses, not related to the village, going back to the manufacturing gas plant operations. We were selected as the designated developer and worked with them very early on in a public engagement process, working together during COVID. We did 8 presentations so that there was transparency, there was an open dialogue on what this site could become. We went through an approval process there. We needed several variances, but they were granted because, you know, we worked with the land use approval, with the boards, and they were quite clear on what they wanted here. We hope to start construction soon. The end result here will be 109 affordable units, beautifying a blighted site, cleaning the site under, again, the brownfield program, building several benefits back to the village. The public garage on the left includes 45 parking spaces back to the village, which is a need for them. A linear park, a greenway extension that connects them to that connects this site and that waterfront area to the downtown. Community space in the building that will be programmed by the village. So a lot of great opportunities for both the local area, the local residents. It's again going to beautify and connect this site back to the downtown. And then while we're working on DPW site, or Station Plaza as we call it, the village sent out an RFQ for 2 surface parking spaces, parking lots, again touching on the theme Raju pointed out. They were looking for a designated developer to start the process, the public engagement process on what could be done here, what multifamily job, what activation of the ground floor. You see here the colored shows umbrellas. That's again the public plaza that Ossining is looking to do under their DRI program. It's very similar to what we just did in New Rochelle, so we hope to be part of that. We hope to work with them on the design and construction of that. A great opportunity to make it a more active space, a more pedestrian-friendly place. A great opportunity, again, taking surface parking lots and creating housing. So I think if we're talking about takeaways on, you know, what can get executed and how villages and towns and cities can help, it's collaboration and being on the same side and having conversations and talking about sites and what our vision is, and does it work, does it not work, where do we think we can get to on this. Pilots are very important on all of these affordable housing deals, and we got a pilot granted on each one of these. And then 3 of these 6 that I showed you are RFQ sites that were village, city, town-owned. So that's them going out and showing the development community, we want to do something on these parcels. So, you know, let's start the process and engage the development community and work to see what we can do. So with that, I think it's a good segue to Karen.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really great to be here. It's great to be here with with Jim, our Wilder-Balter partners, who have really been great partners. And I think partnership in developing housing is really probably the linchpin for success. But I would like to talk more specifically about a local municipality, what it's like on the ground, how complicated it is to do housing, even when your community is pretty receptive to the housing and you have a great need for it. So with that, first we'll talk about the Station Plaza at 30 Water Street. So as Jim mentioned, in 2019, the village issued an RFQ for a preferred developer, and we got a huge response. Wilder-Balter was one of 9 applicants at the time, and they were selected through a fairly rigorous process that I have to acknowledge Rose Noonan's help in. So we were able to get through that process. And one of the things, like, it's really important, have a good partner, but really do your homework too. So in terms of being proactive about housing, Ossining has always been proactive about housing, particularly on the affordable housing front. So I'd like to recognize Jackie Shaw, who's with the, now it's IFCA Housing Network. Originally 50 years ago, a little over 50 years ago, it was established as the Interfaith Council for Action, a neighborhood preservation corp that over the years has rehabilitated probably over 100 units, and now probably owns and manages about 100 of distressed housing for affordable housing. They do an excellent job. I used to work there, that's how I know. Jackie does a fabulous job, and they're a great local partner. So we have a lot of support in Ossining. We're a very diverse community. We embrace diversity. In 2017, I was then working at IFCA, but working with the Village of Ossining and a whole bunch of partners, we did a housing needs assessment that Kevin Dworka executed for us. And many of you, if you're Lula participants, would know Kevin. And that identified, we have followed up on many of the strategies identified in that housing needs assessment, but the idea of providing for deeper and broader level of affordability and more access to housing, affordable housing at various incomes was indeed probably the principal priority. So having a few village-owned lots, in this case, what is now a organic waste yard on your riverfront right next to your train station, probably not highest and best use. But there were other objectives and opportunities we wanted to capitalize on as well. So we wanted space for commercial retail opportunity, mixed use in the development. It is a small neighborhood within a neighborhood station plaza, and we wanted to be able to perpetuate that. The Sing Sing Kill walkway is a really unique feature in Ossining. This gives us the opportunity to extend that walkway down to the waterfront and end in a linear park as part of the complex. That was critically important. And again, I think we all want more walkability, connectivity, less need for parking over time, and more vibrancy, really taking advantage of transit-oriented housing, but in this case, also access to waterfront, access to Main Street, things like that. So the partnership, the community engagement is key, because even when you do your homework, you're doing it over a long period of time. Your elected officials change, people move in and out of the community, people have different needs, goals, and objectives. So after we selected Wilder Balter, we started the engagement process with the community because a lot of issues were raised. So even though we had already established a need for affordable housing, we had people who said, well, wait a second, this is waterfront, it should be luxury. We had people who say, we have too much housing, we need more retail, we need more non-residential ratables, let's do a brewery. That came up too, it always does. So, a whole bunch of different issues. We do have an overcrowded school district, so that's just the reality. Ossining was one of the Harm 5 school districts. The trends are increased enrollment, and that's a concern. Affordable housing typically has more children in it. That was a concern. There's a range of concerns. So in addition to we did, I think, 2 on-site. We literally got on the site to show people what an organic waste yard is actually like and gave them an idea of what it could be. And then we also did some webinars. And that was primarily because it was COVID and we had no better way to reach people. But this actually turned out to be a huge advantage. So we did these webinars via Zoom. We publicized them, we pushed them out on social media, we handed out flyers, we got as many people to participate, but invariably if you get 20 people at one of these things, it's a lot. But the good news is these live in perpetuity, or at least for a long time, on our website. We were able to push them out subsequently, and when these questions would come up, we had a discrete answer, a presentation, a running list of FAQs on our website so we could respond in a unified voice and make sure that a message was getting out. It proved to be a very, very successful way to really alleviate concerns that the community had, because no matter what you're doing, no matter how good it is, no matter what you're doing, the community is going to have concerns. The more diverse the community, the more diverse your concerns. So we focused on why we're doing this, why affordable housing, and why we considered other options, and why we settled on affordable housing. We talked about how the project would be financed. Affordable housing projects, as you know, typically required a payment in lieu of taxes. We have a very high tax rate in Ossining, so that's always a concern, and it's a big concern of the school districts too. We were able to navigate that successfully. That was one of the more highly participated and more controversial discussions. There was also concern about doing housing, particularly affordable housing, on what is a brownfield site, doing it adjacent to a floodplain. There were a lot of concerns about that. So we talked about the brownfield remediation program, which we also talked about very discreetly in a webinar called Dark Matter, but we talked about other things the fact that this would be a LEED Gold or LEED Platinum building, and things that we were doing to really make sure that we would mitigate it, have flood mitigation, and address some of the flooding issues that are there currently. The impact on the school district was also a very, very, very controversial issue. And I think this is key because we talked about school districts and the fact that there's always a tension between schools and development. And this really opened the doorway to a different dialogue than the village had previously with the school district. Because especially with a very overcrowded school district, we always had that tension, like you can't build more housing because our classrooms are overcrowded. Working at IFCA and then subsequently what COVID proved is we not only had a problem with overcrowding in the classroom, we had a problem with overcrowding in the home. So when you're a diverse community, when you're socioeconomically diverse, when you have a high degree of multifamily housing, you do have issues of overcrowding that make it very, very hard during a global pandemic for three school-age children at different grades to be able to access technology and get the education that they need. So while some of our more affluent counterparts were able to address this, because they had homes big enough, they had the technology resources, they were able to create pods and get tutors, a large number of children in Ossining did not have those benefits. So our community suffered just as much. And the superintendent and I sort of have a running disagreement, although it's not a contest. I think overcrowding in the home is every bit as important to address as overcrowding in the classroom. This gave the school district and the municipality an opportunity to come together to solve an issue and address an issue based on shared goals, because we have to take care of our kids in school, but if we're not taking care of them in home, it's not going to be anywhere near as effective. So it really did open up a completely different dialogue than we had before, and we're really working forward on that and being supportive of the school district's plans to increase their capital investment for more classrooms. We're also looking at alternative ways and creating community space. So that was one of the things we talked about in this particular development, because community space can be used in a lot of ways. And if we can work with the school district to use it for alternative learning space, even better. And then we really talked about what it would be like, instead of having an organic waste yard down on our riverfront, to have a really lovely mixed-use development where people could have housing, enjoy the riverfront, hop on the train, and enjoy everything Ossining has to offer. So through that process, which was lengthy, it's very rare that you get developers who are willing to make that kind of investment in time. I will say we did a lot of work on staff time, so I don't think this was tremendous cost to the developer. I think that was fairly de minimis, but the time and talking to people and answering their questions in this case made all the difference in the world. So now we're looking at another underutilized site. So in recognition of the fact that surface parking, again, I'm going to go a little faster. So we have two surface parking lots. We also, Ossining was awarded the Downtown Revitalization Initiative $10 million revitalization grant in 2021. So we use this money to solve a problem that we had been grappling with for over 20 years. How to reverse longer than that, because really we're looking at sites that were demolished during urban renewal, became surface parking lots, and always ripe for redevelopment, but if you can't offset the parking, you can't redevelop. With that money, we're able to build a multimodal transportation hub, which is more than just parking, but will allow for electric vehicles and will be built in a way that it can transition over time if parking's not needed. We, again, issued an RFQ. Wilder Balter and working with St. Catherine Group were selected, and now that project we're just embarking on the same outreach using webinars, despite the fact that COVID isn't an issue anymore, to get the word out and address issues of walkability and all the things that people have talked about today. So that community engagement is being reenacted as we speak, and we can see going, the renderings of what is and what can be. So beyond NIMBYism, we're a community that wants affordable housing. So we're not saying not in my backyard, but there's still issues that have to be dealt with. So there's a process when you're using municipal property. You have to develop a land use acquisition and development agreement. That's a time-consuming process. It has to be done between the municipality and the developer. Pilot negotiations can be challenging in the best of circumstances. You're balancing a lot of issues. In this case, for our Station Plaza, it's the coordination of responsible entities for brownfield cleanup. This is Con Edison has a responsibility. It's a former Con Edison coal tar plant. They have a commitment to remediate the site. The developer shares in that, but right now, the bureaucracy involved in that is taking an enormous amount of time. The other things I want to talk about is the fact that socioeconomically diverse communities already have a high proportion of density. So without addressing issues of infrastructure, it's very, very challenging. And there is no one size fits all, because even in a community that wants housing, oftentimes affordable housing in communities that need it most is not supported by the people who would benefit, because they hear the word lottery and immediately say, I'm never going to get in. Once again, it's the system doing something that doesn't benefit me. That's an issue that we have to look at how we address more discreetly from community to community. So despite all these things, when you want housing, you want it to be done, you have a great site that needs improvement, you can be sitting looking at that site 5 years later after you've done all the approvals, and you're still looking at the site that hasn't broken ground yet. So it's complicated. And with that, I will leave it because I don't have any answers after that.
Hi, thank you. Yep. So again, my name is Kate Van Tassel. I'm the Director of Special Projects at HCR. And I'm super excited to be here because the compact has been my baby. I was just thinking about, some of you, I've probably been on Zooms with many of you guys in this room, and so you see my little face in the square. We did a big roadshow in the first 2 months of the year. And so when they asked me in the panel, I think a lot of the idea was like, what are the reflections on what happened? And so I will admit that part of one of my selfish reasons for being here is actually I'm curious to hear. I'm still going to talk. Let's be clear, but I'm curious to hear the perspective of the people in this room and how you heard about the compact, what your concerns about the compact were. Because as we are in the reflection phase, we worked on this most of, about the second half of all of last year. We had, we met 3 times, literally at one point, we met 3 times a week with Chamber, coming up with the governor's office to come up with like, what's our plan for housing. We did all of the work to find the numbers that Raju much more prettily, and I mean that in a compliment, much more illustratively described. And so we're like, I was about to swear, I probably shouldn't do that in public. Holy, bleep, that there's a housing crisis in our state, and we are really behind. And let's turn that to our advantage, though. We're behind in making changes. What have other states done? And so as we definitely looked at Massachusetts, who is literally 50 years ahead of us, and California in particular. Those were the two because they represented some similarities to New York. California on the size of its scale, and Massachusetts because it is also, a northeastern state with more home rule. And so that is from where a number of ideas came from. And looking at where people had stumbled and faced challenges in the past, and how could we, I will fully admit that I think we hoped we could shortcut some of the challenges that these other states faced. What happened in New York is fairly typical, that it takes a number of tries to get to the point where a successful project or a successful housing policy is implemented. We were hoping to kind of speed run that a little bit, but we faced some challenges. So one of the things that as I said, I would like to be curious. I am curious about kind of how it played out in a lot of the communities. I think a lot of our hypotheses of what we needed to solve for came up in this panel and the panel just before, right? So One of our hypotheses is that, all of us collectively humans are very bad at scale, and in a sense of scale, and that is big and small, right? And so the housing crisis, the scale is ginormous, and we don't have our heads around it. And so one of the things, though, is we feel like we can solve the housing crisis, one building at a time. The project that the mayor just mentioned in Austining is amazing, but I have literally written here in my notes, 5 years later, I think that we can't, we were trying to solve for that. If we do project by project for 5 years for each project, then our housing crisis is going to continue to be a challenge. And then on the flip side of that, one of the things that we certainly bumped into, and psychologically, I understand this, is that people don't like to be told what to do. I get that. And so I really do. I was a teenager, all of us were. But that was one of the lessons that we did learn from other states, is that, and you may have heard this in a lot of the press that came out, is that most places tried incentives for years. And you end up trying to solve problems one project at a time. And the scale of our crisis is so large, we were trying to expand the ability to do that. And then my third piece that I would say, in terms of where we're reflecting on, and we're in the middle of this, and so we do want to hear from you, is I do think the state could have, we spent a lot of time on coming up with a good policy, which I still do absolutely feel strongly that the governor proposed a policy proposal that has very strong background in research and background in experience of other states. I do think there's some lesson learned in how we could have communicated that to both the public and to our elected officials. And we struggle with that because what we found is that, again, I've been listening to how we've spoken today. A couple things. When the Mayor Pugh said that the more abstract something is, the more concern there is. I think that was something that we slammed right into, is that the compact, it's hard to get people to make that link between my parents had to move away because they couldn't pay their taxes, and my child who graduated from college can't move back here because they can't afford it, to we should change my zoning. And so I think that linkage is a challenging one. And so we have been doing research for months, and so we're like, obviously that's what you should do. But we, that it's a hard, I think we could have communicated that a little bit more straightforwardly. I think another thing that we found a challenge is that, again, we were trying to be responsive to folks like yourselves and town councils of what we want to have happen is, again, so if our hypothesis is that you can't solve the housing crisis one building and one project at a time, what is the rezoning if you rezone for as of right over a larger area, and then after that, so you do all the community process that we just talked about and answer the questions and help the fears, do that in one process, and then after that, it becomes more easier and straightforward for the developers to move forward, similar to what New Rochelle did. I mean, that is somewhat the model that New Rochelle did, is it's slightly more easier to move forward after doing one process instead of piece by piece. We saw that as providing flexibility. And so I know I've got handily up here that there's no one size fits all. We actually designed that we got hammered on that, and which is sadly ironic for us because we saw our rezoning proposals as a way that the whole point was folks like yourselves, again, on the zoning boards and the planning boards, you would design your own zoning and just at the the state did set a standard for what would solve that housing crisis. I'm getting the time limit as well. So I will speed up. And so, but again, we had trouble communicating that. I think I would argue that's my current hypothesis, which doesn't mean to say, and then people don't like change. People don't like being told what to do, and people don't like change. And so I think that is a headwinds that we are going to continue to face. And I would love y'all's help in helping us think through what are the ways to address that. And the reason I say that is, full disclosure, I don't know, the governor is not going to walk away from this issue. That is what I know. I don't know what the proposals will be next year, because we're not even done this year. So, but I do think that, again, going back to where I started, the scale of the crisis is still big. And so we do still, at least for me, I'm a policy person, not a political person. So if the governor says something different, that is clearly she is in charge. But But we do think that the large swing at addressing the scale through big actions, um, and balancing that flexibility to allow localities to make their own changes. And we did have, what we called a consequence, that if there's a denial of specifically affordable housing, then there was a consequence for that and then some requirements for TOD, which in this room I would assume everybody understands that that is a very in a planning circles is a very kind of standard understanding, but there's a lot of fear mongering about that, going back to that idea of what is if it's more abstract, then we get more concern. And so I think, as we're coming back to the drawing table, I think we're still going to work on that same foundation of policy research and policy tools that other states have done. But all that to say, and this is again my pitch, I've got my cards up at the back. I think we want to go talk to the folks in this room. Like, I'm going to continue to do not even a roadshow. I'm going to do a tour around the state of getting a more fine-grained understanding of what the concerns are and how the governor's office can assist in that. My last piece, and I know I'm getting the nod. The last piece, I think that it is important. We definitely had multiple conversations with people on planning boards, elected officials who are like, you know what? If I voted for this, I will get voted out of office. But we need you to tell us to do this. And so, but I mean, truly, so they agree, they understand where we're coming from. And I to me, that is a rational position. That's one of the reasons that the governor took this step, is that my other spiel that I give is you can't solve regional problems with local solutions. And so everybody has a role to play in the regional problems, which the housing crisis is certainly a regional problem. But by breaking it up between the multiple local solutions, then one solution doesn't have to solve the whole thing. And so that is the state's role. And that's why we took on this role of moving forward with thinking about what's the role for the state for solving this statewide crisis, but also trying to bake in that flexibility for each locality to solve their piece of it in the way that made most sense for them. So again, I think we can communicate that better. Maybe there are different, this is only because we're still, I am still trying to come to grip, figure out what happened. But we're going to get up off the mat and then figure out what the right policy tools are. I don't think TOD is going away because, again, it's a straightforward policy strategy. But maybe the ways we implement it would be different. So I would love to hear from lots of you, particularly the planning. I am a planner myself. My background's in planning. And so I've also stood in front of people screaming at us, as I'm sure everybody on this panel has been, although Raju was screaming at me at one point when he was at city council and I was at the city. He didn't scream. I shouldn't say that. That's not fair. But I've been, I understand that role, and it is hard to get yelled at. But I think that as again, the Mayor Pugh said as well, like once people see the outcomes, it's one of the reasons I keep doing this work, is once people see the outcomes, they're like, oh, that's great. And so sometimes it just takes a little patience. All right, I will stop. I'm getting the wave.
No,
but thank you again. Thank you for having me here.
Karen. All right, so let me take a question. I don't know if Karen, you want to. Oh, you look like you were going to say something, so I didn't want to. Okay. Any questions for our panelists? We also, this is why we have our networking at the end, so you can pop up and talk to everybody here. But I have to say, I think seeing the work that everyone here is doing is inspiring, and I think that's what we wanted to do today, was showcase this and show how municipalities, developers are working together and what this can look like on some of these sites. So I appreciate it, and Karen, I especially appreciate your words, because that insight as to, and I think everyone here is nodding their heads, like those were the challenges, these are the opportunities, and see that in that municipal perspective. So thank you. Last swing at the piñata before, okay, yes. And I know no one, when we have this recorded, we won't hear the questions because I don't have the mic running around, but that's okay. So it doesn't matter. You could shout so everyone can hear it, though.
So that's always a challenge because no matter how much outreach you do, there's always somebody who says, I never heard or I can't get there. We do everything, we have a large Spanish-speaking contingent, so everything we do is translated to Spanish. We have 2 elected officials who speak fluent Spanish, and we do a lot of work working with partner organizations, whether it's the IFCA Housing Network or Neighbors Link or Open Door Family Medical Centers, to make sure we're getting out to people who are working and busy and probably would benefit the most by some of these policies. We do written questionnaires, we do go on site, and now that COVID is alleviated, in addition to the webinars, we plan multiple on-site. The farmers market on Saturdays is a great place to go. Local churches, different community events, really meeting people where they are. And now we have even brokered this much better working relationship with the school district, so partnering with them on these things. It is always hard to get people's attention. It's just something that we just keep working on, but we do try to recognize that the vast majority of people who don't, who aren't able to get there, don't even know that the project's happening, don't understand. We do the best that we can, and we really rely on a network of not only elected officials and staff, but volunteers throughout our tight-knit yet diverse and large community to get the word out there.
And I agree with that. I think that then, and I love particularly the webinars idea because that allows people to sign in on their own time. But I think one of the interesting things that, to your point, is that, and I would say this to folks that are taking those votes and are supporting things in this room and outside this room, of it's a blind spot often of, for building a new 200 unit building, the neighbors who are there, they're able to show up at the meeting and say, I'm nervous about this. But the future, college student who is up in Binghamton and wants to move back to Westchester, they're not coming to the meeting, but they're the people that are going to be able to benefit. So it's not necessarily, again, that goes back to I have the state hat on, so that's easy for me to say. But I do think that it's a blind spot it's not just, these scary new people coming to my town. It's our kids who are, who want to come back, and they're the ones that benefit. And so when we hear from the people right in front of us, which again, I'm not saying we shouldn't at all, but we're not, it's particularly for the people that need to make these decisions, is sometimes to take into account future residents who are not scary outsiders, might be our own families, or, not that I think outsiders are bad, but you know what I mean? But that's a perspective that by definition doesn't come up in community outreach. And I think that's something, though, I think is worth kind of rolling into the way we think about how this works.
Okay. Elka? Hi.
My question's about home rule. Obviously, it's I think probably the greatest challenge to increasing zoning. Question is for Raju, but also Kate and Tiffany. I don't know if you have thoughts on this. So you mentioned Oregon; they also have some form of home rule. Is there any conversation around why New York State, why it implements its home rule the way it does? Are the communities in New York State actually following home rule, or have we kind of, turned it into something that it was never intended to be? Is there room for massive legal action against municipalities that will not have zone? What's your take on this?
Some big questions that I'm probably not qualified to all answer. So I'll just speak maybe a little bit more abstractly and less to the legal questions, which I don't know if Kate wants to jump into. I think that this conversation around housing growth, I think, is forcing us to look at a lot of our assumptions around who we are and how we govern, that I think is actually a healthy conversation. And is probably kind of overdue because the challenges that we face, I think, as a state, as a region, I think our government capacity isn't up to the challenge, frankly. And that's not a criticism of any of the folks here. It's a question of, I think, institutional building. And so I think whether it's climate adaptation or transportation or housing, I think we do need to rethink our institutions to think about the problems we have today, not the problems they were designed for in a different era. And I'll just give one example, sort of environmental review, I think, as an easy place to start. You know, the National Environmental Protection Act in the early 1970s came from a real growing consciousness about the impact that collectively we'd had on our environment. But today, it's often a tool, as I think you all know, that can impede and slow projects that really have tremendous environmental benefit, whether that's infill housing or whether that's transit system development. And so there's now a conversation about, okay, well, how well does environmental review actually serve the environmental goals that we have today as opposed to the policy framework we had in the 1970s? And so I think that work of rethinking these institutions and kind of governance structures, I think is long overdue to solve some of these challenges. And I think home rule is certainly a part of that conversation. I don't think we should be afraid of noting that the problems are different than when they were, when our regulatory institutions were first created.
Yeah, that's a great answer. The other things I would say, again, behind the curtains, I think we had hoped, that, you know, if something is a matter of state concern, that's how we wrote the laws, is that the idea concept that housing is a matter of state concern. And again, going back to everything that I just said, we have a crisis. Then we would change the city, town, and village law. That was how it was structured, right? Is that we change the city, town, and village law to update the authority of the state to have any say, any even small say, which again, we designed to have flexibility. And so from a legal perspective, we thought, you know, the way we wrote it was a way to, it wasn't even overturning home rule. It was a way to do exactly actually what Raju said, to address where we are today. It's a hard thing for local elected officials to vote for, right? And so, that's just a structure of the state and a structure of any local affected. The reason I say that is that off the record, we literally got people saying, God, I wish we had Mount Laurel. I wish somebody had sued us however many years ago. And then we wouldn't have to take that vote because the courts would have made us do it. And so I'm still hopeful that we can have some brave leadership, as again came up in the first panel, that we can do this without being sued. But I wouldn't say that is outside their own possibility, because there is there are real, I would agree personally, this is not me speaking for the state, there are real legal issues about where our history of segregation, but I'm still hopeful that we can legislatively make the changes that we do think are necessary.
You're here. I agree. I think our local governments can do this.
I have
been
faith
doing
in
it for
people.
you.
I do.
They're gonna. That's why we're here today.